and guests? Thank you. To our speaker this evening, Michael Vinson, rare book dealer and writer of Rareability. Tonight, Mike will talk about a rare book, Rogue in Texas, you're going to hear a lot about, which is wonderful. Recently published a fascinating book on the same subject and has received universally great reviews. I'll leave to Greg Thompson to introduce Michael and share with you Mike's extraordinary background and accomplishments. Let's see who we have who are visitors. Just let's introduce visitors for a minute.
Ken, do we have one person that I've recognized who I think is a new member?
Well, no, and I'm going to get to that as soon as let's do that. Okay. Let's do the guests, and then we'll get to our new. I think we have both of our new members actually on.
Super.
Do we have any visitors that somebody would like to introduce or that would like to introduce themselves? Okay. Well, the guests lost if they didn't bother to show up. Happy to announce we have two new Utah Westerners, Jennifer Duncan. Jennifer, wave. Thank you. She is the book curator for Utah State University, which means she's the unit head for special collections and archives at the Maricoz Library at Utah State, is the calendar 2021 interim dean of libraries. She's interested in Western American history, 19th century Europe. Sounds familiar. She's busily engaged in many history organizations, made many presentations on archives and archival materials and history, has worked on a number of exhibits. Jennifer's sponsor is Scott Bushman. Thank you, Scott. And we're going to make Jennifer and the next person I'm going to introduce in a minute, Todd Welch, introduce themselves a little bit more for next month's newsletter. Our other new Westerner is Todd Welch, who also works at the Maricoz Library. He's the Associate Dean of Special Collections there. He's deeply interested in Western American history with special focus on Western migration and railroads. He's interested in the Civil War and political history, both national and regional. He's a member of many wonderful history organizations, has often made presentations and published articles. Todd's sponsor is Greg Thompson. Thank you, Greg. Let's welcome Jennifer and Todd as our newest Utah Westerners. Todd, let's have you wave too. I saw you. There you go. Thank you. Good job. You'll note from the newsletter that a memorial service for Michael Brown, who many of you know from OCTA and other Trails Association, who passed away during the pandemic. So there's a memorial service for him on the afternoon of June 19th in Sheridan, Wyoming. There's a notice of that in the newsletter. Sad to announce that former Westerner Hugh McHale, who operated Bear Hollow Books in South Jordan, passed away last week. He wasn't apparently the result of a fall in his workshop, which sounds like an untimely way to go. Be sure to read the newsletter. It's full of good stuff. There's a review from Kurt Bench of Michael Vinson's book, lots of announcements and interesting information, a history column from Hal Schindler, and an unusual amount of useful information about fun things to do. We will be having in-person meetings at the Alticom. We'll begin having them again no later than September. There is a small possibility we'll try to do something in August with Matt Harris and stream him in. He can't be here, but maybe we'll try to Zoom him in. We'll see. We're going to talk about that. Keep your options open on that. Watch the newsletter for developments. I hate to keep harping on it. Dues are still due. That's why they call them dues. If you haven't paid your annual dues, $65, please do so immediately to Craig Smith. There's information about Craig in the directory, in the newsletter, and everywhere else. So let's get those paid so we can continue to operate as well as we have. Are there any announcements any of you have that you'd like to present to the whole group?
Hey, Ken?
Please, Kurt.
Did you say that you wondered if Matt Harris could be here in August?
No, I know he can't be.
Okay.
The question is whether we try to meet here ourselves in person, but stream him in by Zoom.
I see. Okay. I just wanted to clarify.
We have to figure out how to do that. That's a possibility in the future. We've had some great speakers last year that we wouldn't have been able to have because we could get them on Zoom. The question is, can we meet in person in the Alta Club, stream somebody in, have a question and answer period with them, and sort of expanded our horizons a little bit, having learned something from the pandemic period with Zoom. We just need.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
That's the answer, I think, Kurt. Anything else? Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to Greg Thompson to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ken. And thanks everybody for joining and for our technical team for making it happen. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back to speak to Utah Westerners, Michael Vinson. Michael, as I think most of you know from having probably dealt with him, is one of the most erudite and eclectic book dealers I know and have had the opportunity to work with in my nearly 40 years at the Marriott Library. It's a privilege to introduce him tonight, to call him my colleague, my friend, and a wonderful supporter to such places as the J. Willard Marriott Library. Michael carries a distinguished set of educational credentials with him. They start, they move into his first master's degree, which was given by the Department of History at Brigham Young University, and that was granted in 1986. That degree, as I mentioned, was in history. He followed that up with a degree from the University of Chicago Graduate Library School, LMS degree in 1987, where he focused on the history of the book. And I know from my discussions with Michael, that was quite a experience and certainly helped to shape his career. He followed that up in the 21st century with a second master's from the University of Cambridge in the School of Divinity. And there, his dissertation topic, as they noted it there, is entitled Jewish and Christian Communities at Europos in Roman Antiquity, a comparison of the synagogue and church. I do declare to you folks, this gentleman is deep into his research and his work, and it shows in his career. As I mentioned, I've known Michael quite a long time, and I was trying to place when I first met him through our mutual agency, the Marriott Library. I suspect it was probably in the 1990s. Michael, completing those degrees, his first job was at Southern Methodist University in the DeGroyer Library, where he was a curator in the special collections. He left that and started in 1992 his own rare book company and books as a bookseller, and his career has just literally exploded from that time to the present. He's a very accomplished, well-connected bookseller, and you go to one of the national, international book fairs with him, and he knows everybody there. He has published, as we will hear in part about tonight, several works that take him back to his study of the history of the book. The first that I'll mention is a publication from the Oklahoma Press, University of Oklahoma Press, 2016. and it's entitled Edward Eberstadt and Company, 1908-1975, Rare Booksellers of Western Americana. His second book I'm going to mention is the one that he will speak to tonight. I believe that Ken gave at least part of the title. It is entitled Bluffing Texas Style: The Arson, Forgery, and High Stakes Poker Capers of Rare Book Dealer Johnny Jenkins, also from the Oklahoma Press, 2020. What most people don't know is he has a third book entitled Motoring Tourists and the Scenic West, which he did as a catalog presentation at SMU, the DeGoyer Library, when he was there in 1989. Michael is not only a distinguished bookseller, but he is an individual who is quick to step forward to support and help develop a program. He did that with our attempts at Marriott Library with our book collector night and spoke several times there. He has won several awards I'll mention. He was named a fellow at the American Antiquarian Society in October of 2019, just recently. He sits on, or he sat on, the National Board of Governors for the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. That would be his main association as a bookseller from 2004 to 2008. He is also, and this is most intriguing, the Chancellor's Council member from the University of Texas at Austin. He was elected to that post in 2000. He is also a Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honor Society member. It's an honor to welcome Michael Vinson. Michael, the Zoom podium is yours.
Greg, thank you for that very generous introduction, and I'll be sure to repay you with a nice drink at some point in the future.
Thank you.
I am privileged to be able to speak to the Utah Westerners tonight, one of my favorite group of Westerners in the country, because of your enthusiasm for Utah and Western history and the things that we hold in common. Johnny doesn't cross the Utah path as much, but he definitely crossed the forging path, as you'll hear about tonight. And for most Utahns and Westerners that way, you'll have some affinity and some regard for what Texans underwent from Johnny when he was in his prime. On a Sunday afternoon in April 1989, Kay Freeman found a body in the Colorado River, 30 miles from Austin, Texas. Freeman was baiting her line, casting it out and trolling, hoping that a large catfish would bite. An hour later, about 6:30 p.m., Bastrop County Dispatch sent a sheriff's deputy to the river to check on an abandoned Mercedes. Just before the deputy arrived, Freeman cast her bait in the shallower waters closer to the riverbank. Her hook snagged, and when she pulled it up, a body bobbed to the surface among the tangled branches of a willow on the bank. By the time the deputy arrived at the bridge, he had a much bigger problem than an abandoned Mercedes. John Jenkins had been shot once with a large caliber gun pressed to the back of his head. The bullet exited through his left temple. To the tight circle of booksellers, the sudden death of an especially influential fellow like John Jenkins was momentous news. Rare booksellers describe their close-knit community this way: when a dealer in New York sneezes, one in Los Angeles says Gesundheit. In 1975, Jenkins had engineered the largest rare book coup of the 20th century, the purchase of the legendary Eberstadt inventory of rare Americana. The selling price was nearly $3 million, or around $35 million in today's money, and garnered him coverage in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He had a history book published by the University of Texas on the day he graduated from high school. And he edited and published a 10-volume set of the papers of the Texas Revolution. He authored a massive bibliographic guide to the history of Texas called Basic Texas Books. One scholar called it the best research tool ever created for Texas. He was the youngest person ever elected president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. Hollywood also appealed to Jenkins. He dabbled in movies and helped to finance the highly profitable 1974 horror film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. By the way, his family is still receiving quarterly royalties from that movie. He invested in oil wells and once went undercover with FBI agents to help them recover a cache of hand-colored Audubon copper plate engravings stolen from Union College. They later gratefully gave him an honorary Doctor of Letters degree. Jenkins loved publicity. He mastered the unforgettable entrance. He showed up at the normally reserved Autumn Boston Rare Book Fair in Massachusetts, wearing a pinstripe suit, shiny alligator cowboy boots, a white Stetson cowboy hat, full-length dark mink coat, puffing away on a Cuban cigar. Jenkins' luxurious lifestyle sparked outlandish speculation about the motives for his death. The high life requires constant sources of cash and credit, and there were certainly financial crises in Jenkins' life. Jenkins was a very successful blackjack player who counted cards and raked in the chips until the casinos banned him. Later, he played high-stakes poker in Las Vegas under the nickname Austin Squatty, and he had lines of credit at 23 different casinos. Had mobsters from Las Vegas gone after Jenkins for uncollected gambling debts? Then there were the two Audubon thieves with known mafia connections who received long prison sentences after Jenkins turned them over to the FBI. Was Jenkins' death a revenge killing from the mob? The rumors that Jenkins' death was connected to the sale of the many forged Texas documents he sold were just as disturbing to rare book dealers and collectors. No one sold more of them than Jenkins. The Texas forgeries were of the type that rare book dealers called black tulips. The name comes from the Dutch tulip bloom speculation bubble of the 1600s. It is a metaphor for something so rarely seen that a collector might have one chance in a lifetime to acquire one. Rare book dealers enjoy boasting among fellow dealers about how many copies of an especially rare item they have handled. Western gunfighters notch their pistols, but rare book dealers tally these transactions in their catalogs. And their printed record is a kind of provenance and genealogy for these rare books. Jenkins, who was always so eager to gloat about almost anything, never ever published any of the Texana black tulips in his catalogs. And even more oddly for a publicity hound, never issued a single press release about any of his very, very rare Texana discoveries. Secrets need masks to protect the deeply buried things and to project images of success and wealth. I met Jenkins once and got a small taste of his effortless persona. I worked at a rare book library in Dallas and occasionally ordered relatively cheap Texas and Western imprints from the Jenkins Company catalogs. A month before he died, I saw John Jenkins in the book exhibitor hall of the annual Texas State Historical Meeting. After I worked up the courage to approach him and introduce myself, he turned to a collector standing next to him and said, "This is Michael Vinson. He's our best customer." While Jenkins flattered me, even I knew then that if I were their best customer, they were in a heap of trouble. Little did I know how much. This part of his story that I'm going to relate to you now covers the last year of Jenkins' life. There were three threads that tightened around him. One was his compulsive poker playing. Another was the exposure of the forgery of Texas documents. The third was the investigation of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms into a suspicious fire inside Jenkins' offices for which Jenkins had filed an insurance claim of more than $1 million. The tightening of the noose began in 1987 when Jenkins' rare book sales took a disastrous turn. His biggest customer, Bob French, threw a party to show off his collection of Texana at his oil production offices in Midland, Texas. One of the scholars he invited was J. Evetts Haley, a respected historian. Haley had authored books such as The XIT Ranch and a biography of the famed Texas cattleman Charles Goodnight, which were collectible in their own right. Haley and Jenkins were political opposites. Aside from their differences, Haley never cared for Jenkins' way of dealing. The antagonism wasn't helped a couple of years previously when Jenkins called Haley a pompous ass in the newspaper interview. Haley had heard about a forged Travis broadside offered to H. Ross Perot. In late 1985, an Arkansas dealer offered the Travis Victory or Death broadside issued from the Alamo to Perot, who did not rely on trust for his purchases. Perot had the document examined by experts at Yale University in early 1986. George Miles and another curator compared Perot's copy to the authentic copy at the Beinecke Library, and they discovered that it was a facsimile, largely through a broken typeset letter in the original, which was clumsily repaired in the forgery. The Arkansas dealer returned the broadside to the dealer from whom he had bought it, John Jenkins. When French showed off his Victory or Death broadside from the Alamo, it was with no small degree of pleasure that Haley told him it was fake. Bob, Haley said, Jenkins stuck you in a squeeze chute like a bull does a cow. French was raised in West Texas and knew what the cowboy slang meant. A squeeze chute was a narrow steel bar enclosure to hold cows for artificial insemination. French was not only embarrassed in front of his guests, he was angry at Jenkins for taking advantage of him. Up to the time of the reception, French had spent over $500,000, around $1.5 million in today's money, with Jenkins, making him their company's most important customer during the 1980s. Now French called on another dealer to examine his library and see how badly Jenkins had stuck him. Eventually, the comparison of French's copies of Texas books to known copies and bibliographies showed that about 60% of his Texas collection, just over $250,000 worth, was misdescribed or incomplete. In addition, they found 3 other Texas forgeries that Jenkins had sold him for a total of 4. French remembered that Jenkins had given him a standing guarantee of being able to return for credit any book from his collection. French had locked horns with the best oilman in Texas and figured he could take on Jenkins' penny ante games. French devised a plan to return the books to Jenkins and make good on the warranty without tipping his hand. He put on his best poker face in June of 1987 for his visit with Jenkins in Austin. He proceeded to select rare Texas book after rare book. Jenkins was elated to think that he had just sold over $300,000 worth of his rare Texana. Jenkins offered to ship the books to French in Midland, as he had before previously, perhaps hoping to play his old trick of substituting incomplete or facsimile volumes for more valuable books. French appeared to think it over for a minute and then said, I'll help. Wrap them up and I'll take them with me now in my car. Even with so many of his very best materials gone, Jenkins must have been positively glowing at the thought of that French invoice receivable driving off to Midland. That would be $1 million sale in today's money. 3 days later, a UPS truck delivered 10 boxes of rare books to Jenkins, all from Bob French. The puzzled employee showed Jenkins the large shipment, and he also wondered what was going on, since French had left his premises less than a week earlier with a big group of new Texana. He called French, who told him exactly what he had done and why. Jenkins had not only lost his best customer, he lost a $300,000 receivable from that sale, and French returned to him $300,000 worth of unsaleable and incomplete inventory. Just 2 months later, in September 1987, the Manchac Volunteer Fire Department received a fire alarm call for Jenkins' office warehouse complex. The fire department was located less than a mile away, and Jenkins and his employees were well known there because they ate nearly week at the fire hall kitchen, sort of a fried catfish place, which is how fire departments, volunteer places in Texas fund themselves. The fire department responded with 8 trucks, but some firefighters were surprised to pass Jenkins in his gold Mercedes-Benz speeding away from the smoking building. The volunteers worked quickly and had the fire under control about 10 minutes after arriving. More ominously for Jenkins, the fire captain said that without clear evidence of accidental cause, he would be contacting the state fire marshal's office and asking them to investigate the fire as a possible arson. Before news of the forgeries reached the public, Jenkins was quick to dismiss. So he's got this, lost his customer, and now apparently a fire has started and he's trying to get $1 million of insurance coverage. 3 years previously, he did have a fire in his office warehouse. He was the only one there that day. They determined it was accidental in that case, and he received a $2 million insurance settlement. Before news of the forgeries reached the public, Jenkins was quick to dismiss any talk of forgery. His treatment changed when the news of the forgeries broke in Texas Monthly magazine. Jenkins probably realized he had a weak hand because of the many fakes he had sold and decided he could no longer ignore the detective work that was being done by another bookseller at the time, Tom Taylor. Jenkins claimed that he was taken in by the forgeries and was just as surprised as everybody else. But despite that, the Travis County Attorney's Office decided to open an investigation into Jenkins' connections with the forgery. Some of the pressure to open the investigation came from Governor Bill Clements, who had purchased a forgery of the Texas Declaration of Independence indirectly from Jenkins. The arson investigators did a chemical analysis of the origins of the fire and found that a volatile accelerant was used, either alcohol or acetone. The fire investigators also learned that Jenkins was several years delinquent on his federal tax returns. Now they finally got their interview with Jenkins, who up to this point had been evading them. He insisted there was no way he would profit from a fire since the insurance proceeds would still leave him $1 million short of what his debts required, and he would still have to declare bankruptcy. Investigators pressed him about his poker playing in Las Vegas, but Jenkins insisted he was almost always a winner. He claimed that he was in the black for 1987 and so far for 1988. The investigators wanted to confirm his story, so they asked him which casinos he played in most often. Jenkins refused to tell them. Then they asked him to take a polygraph examination. Jenkins adamantly refused. "I will never take one," he said, "because I don't believe in them." The statement left the investigators wondering if Jenkins really was a high-stakes poker champion or if he was someone hiding large debts to casinos. It was around this time the investigators began referring to the Jenkins fire as felony arson. By the late 1980s, Jenkins was spending 40 to 50 days a year gambling at the poker tables. While Austin Squatty was known as a careful player who did not often bluff, he could sometimes go all in with a weak hand when he was feeling pressed. Jenkins preferred to cast himself as the thoughtful, conservative poker player rather than the riskier, cockier styles used by professionals. He acknowledged that his lack of intuition in poker sometimes hindered him. "A lot of people make subconscious decisions based on things they've seen hundreds of times," he said. "I don't have that kind of experience or intuition, and I think about every move I make. Sometimes it works against me." In Binion's World Series of Poker, Jenkins was among the last 7 players and drew an ace-king of spades in his opening deal. It's considered a slightly stronger start than opening with a low pair. Jenkins decided to scare out the rest of the table and build a good start for the chips for the final push of the game. He went all in on this weak opening hand with a bid of $150,000, which should have scared out everybody except the strongest. Tom McElvoy, who had an equal amount of chips on the table, called with a pair of 6s. Jenkins said he probably knew I either had an ace-king or a baby pair, a very low pair, or else I would have suckered him in with a lower bet. Jenkins did not get any of the cards he needed to win, and McElvoy got his pot. McElvoy went on to win, boosted by that success, the World Series of Poker that year. When the ATF investigators were waiting for Jenkins' financial records, they met with his longtime friend and occasional attorney and told him that Jenkins was lying. "Now, wait a minute," the friend said, sure that they were speaking hastily. But the investigators were indignant and told the attorney that the book dealer was lying. Their visit ended abruptly, but the attorney remembered their final words: "We're going to indict Jenkins for arson." After their visit, the attorney called Jenkins, who was desperate for any way out from the federal investigation. The attorney advised him to withdraw his insurance claim. He thought if there was no insurance fraud, there could be no arson charges. The ATF investigators soon found out about Jenkins' new strategy. They spoke with Lloyd's of London and found out Jenkins had not filed the paperwork to make a formal claim for his losses. Unfortunately for Jenkins, this did not mean the end of the investigation. The building offices were rented, meaning the owner of the building was still filing insurance claims for his losses, and thus the arson investigation into Jenkins would continue. The financial repercussions of news about the forgeries began to affect the business image and reputation of the Jenkins Company. Jenkins typically exhibited at the Boston Book Fair in November, but that year he canceled his exhibit booth. That was in 1988, even though he still attended. Even though the firm was in financial straits, he still picked up dinner and drinks tabs during his visit to Boston. One evening, he invited a group of bookseller friends to dinner, and over their protest, insisted on paying for the entire bill. After the dinner, one dealer looked askance as Jenkins swung his feet out from under the table and proceeded to take $100 bills out of his cowboy boots to pay for the meal. Another dealer was not convinced by Jenkins' bravado, and in a private moment after the dinner asked him how he was holding up. Jenkins looked at him and said, "Our backs are to the wall." During this visit, Jenkins had to face the ABAA Board of Governors over the accusations of arson and forgery. He was serving at the time as the security officer and liaison to the FBI for the ABAA. He played the same bluff to the Board of Governors as he used to newspaper reporters, and saying that he was taken by surprise just as much as anybody else was by the forgeries. Perhaps Jenkins thought his statement would save his reputation and membership, but after the board meeting, he still resigned under pressure as the security officer. In the main Antiques Digest story about Jenkins' forgeries, Jenkins emphatically denied ever buying the printing plates or forged broadsides from Dorman David, who admitted that he had made them. The idea that I would have bought any place like that from a drug addict, a man like Dorman David, is just preposterous. I certainly deny the charge. Denial or not, when I went through Jenkins' archives, some 25,000 pieces of paper, two of the more significant ones that I found were check stubs in the archives, showing payments from Jenkins to Dorman David in the fall of 1970, the same time that Dorman said he sold the plates and the forgeries to Jenkins. The check stubs from Jenkins to Dorman do not list what was purchased, but they are proof of the transactions. By the end of January, the ATF was discussing bringing felony arson charges against him. Despite the ATF investigation and other financial problems, Jenkins could not resist the call of another poker tournament. He went to Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas for Amarillo Slim's Super Bowl of Poker in January '89. The buy-ins for the beginning games were lower, only $225, and rebuys were permitted, meaning that as long as you had money, you could keep yourself in the game. By midnight on January 31st, there were two players left in the Omaha game, John Jenkins and Lyle Berman. Jenkins went all in on his hand of a pair of jacks. Berman followed with a pair of tens. Each waited in the smoke-filled casino for the flop, the final cards to be shown. The first card was a king, then a 5, then an ace, then a 3, so far no advantage to either player. Jenkins was almost certainly whispering "Jack, Jack" to himself when the final card was played, a jack. Jenkins took the pot of $99,000. He certainly must have thought his luck had turned. He had $10,000 buy-in money for the Super Bowl tournament now, but he lost that and did not gain anything else, and almost certainly lost the remainder of his money to side bets at the other poker games. Sometime in 1976, Jenkins had sold William Reese, a famous Americana book dealer, a forged Texas Declaration of Independence for $15,000, and even let him take it. At the time, Reese thought Jenkins was doing him an enormous favor by letting him have the document. He took the broadside to Dallas and sold it for $30,000 to a very pleased Governor William Clements for his Texana collection. Reese later acknowledged his naivete. He should have wondered at the time why Jenkins just didn't sell it directly to Clements himself. Years later, in 1988, as news of the forgery spread, Governor Clements returned the broadside to Reese for a refund. In one of Reese's last visits with Jenkins around January 1989, he was still trying to get reimbursed by Jenkins for the forged broadside that he had returned to him. Jenkins asked him if he would take some rare books in trade. Bill said that he would. Johnny looked at him and asked, "Bill, do you think I was the forger?" Reese politely but non-committedly replied, "Honestly, Johnny, I don't know." Then Jenkins said, "Don't you think I would have charged a lot more for the broadsides if they were actually real?" This was as close to a confession as anybody ever got from Johnny before he died. "I really thought we were friends," Reese said with a note of sadness in his voice. The forged Texas Declaration, now hung on his office wall, has a macabre reminder of when he looked up to and trusted Jenkins. Everything was coming apart for Johnny at this time. The forgeries, the arsons, the debts from his business. The bank in Austin put a foreclosure notice on his book property. Jenkins had defaulted on a $600,000 loan, and they scheduled a public auction of his property for May 2nd. The week before Jenkins died, his attorney met with the ATF investigators. Jenkins was ready to meet with the ATF, the attorney told them, and he was probably ready to come clean on his gambling debts and the financial status of the Jenkins company. He might even submit to a polygraph. But the attorney stressed that Jenkins was extremely distraught and told them something Jenkins had mentioned to him. If they tried to indict him, he would commit suicide. What the ATF investigators did not tell his attorney at this time was that they had already met with the assistant U.S. attorney about criminal charges, and they were already preparing the indictments to be served by a U.S. Marshal. The Saturday before Jenkins died, he came into the office with a grin and an optimistic attitude, which must have been reminiscent of his teenage days. A boy who grew up next door remembered Jenkins singing in the shower every morning in Beaumont, Texas. Their houses were close together, and on the many warm and humid days, he could hear Jenkins' voice drifting out the bathroom window. The current country or pop hits didn't appeal to Jenkins. His favorite song was "You Are My Sunshine," a smash hit in Louisiana in 1939 when it was recorded by the Pine Ridge Boys. His rare book manager felt encouraged enough by his manner that morning to ask him how Jenkins felt about the company's balance sheet. Jenkins smiled and told him he had a plan for fixing all of his finances, and everything was going to be all right. Sometime that Saturday, Jenkins learned from his attorney the ATF was about to have him indicted for arson. They had done the courtesy call the Saturday before, and then on Monday morning, they would serve him with the U.S. Marshal's indictments. He called his closest friend that night and told him he was going to be ruined, reputation and all, and mentioned suicide. The friend argued with him and told him it was nonsense, that people got off on arson charges all the time. Sure, they can show it was arson, he told him, but they can't as easily show that you were the arsonist. You can fight this thing, Johnny. But the friends felt that something was different about Jenkins' reaction this time. Usually John was the first one to fight for his reputation and honor, but for some reason he did not want to do so now. What John did not tell his friend was that the thing he least wanted the world to know. It was not that he had done the forgeries, nor even that he had started the fire in his office. Instead, it was that he was not the poker champion who had been featured on the covers of so many gambling and other publications. And the ATF indictment and trial would reveal that to the world. Gambling debts from lines of credit at casinos are closely held secrets. After Jenkins' death, two close friends of Johnny's independently approached Benny Binion, who ran the World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, and asked him if Jenkins had left a lot of markers, debt, from his poker playing. Benny Binion, who was an outlaw and a gangster in his own right, told each of them that no, Jenkins didn't have any gambling debts, which was technically true. By the time Jenkins' friends asked Binion about his debts, there were none, because the casinos had been paid with Jenkins' life insurance money. The inside informant, who asked to remain anonymous, confirmed to me that Jenkins' poker gambling debts at the casinos totaled nearly $1 million at the time of his death. And it was a point of honor with Jenkins to be sure those debts were paid after his death. Jenkins could tell tall, entertaining stories, but he never learned how to tell poker tales. Poker players tell and read stories with raised eyebrows, a second glance at their cards, or by shuffling and restacking their chips. Each player hopes to tell a convincing enough story to fool the other players into either surrendering their chips or to read the other players' stories well enough to know when they should fold. When one longtime tournament player said that Austin Squatty's strength is his short stack game, he was paying Jenkins the ultimate player's compliment. Even when the flop didn't give Jenkins any cards and his bluffs weren't sticking, he still held out hope that the river, the last card dealt, would save him. A card game for money that relied on tall tales would seem to be Jenkins' natural métier. But while poker's storytelling made Jenkins feel at home, it was a place he could never fully inhabit. The game's pots burned him more often than not. Poker was the last refuge of the original Texas bluffer, and the price it extracted from Jenkins' life of bluster and exaggeration became his ultimate, unpayable wager. Squatty's final stack was short, and the river was dry. Had Jenkins ever discussed suicide, and particularly ways to make it look like something else? Methods for faking a suicide once came up at one of Jenkins' home poker games. On those occasions, The suicide exclusionary clause for life insurance policies was being discussed because it had just been ruled unconstitutional. One fellow brought up the story of the man who faked his suicide by making it look like murder. Jenkins spoke up. "I have the perfect suicide," he said. "You get in a boat, you tie the gun to a balloon, and the guy shoots himself in the back of the head. Then the balloon would float the gun downstream until it leaked enough air and sank. The suicide exclusion clause wouldn't matter since the death would look like murder." When one friend heard that Jenkins was found shot, he asked where he was shot, and not surprised that it was in the back of the head, just behind the right ear. A couple of years after this poker table talk, when Jenkins was being investigated, he asked his friend again about the suicide exclusion rule to be sure he understood how it worked. The suicide exclusion clauses on Jenkins' insurance policies had already expired before his death, so there was no monetary need to make his death look like a murder, only perhaps a theatrical one. Sheriff Ken Kersey said that a large caliber gun was missing from Jenkins' office after his death. In Jenkins' car by the river, they found a half-drunk Coke, a half-eaten sandwich, and the receipt, which also showed that Jenkins purchased a bag of ice. But no bag of ice was found at the scene of the death. One friend remembered chatting with Jenkins' son Jay sometime after the funeral. Jay was holding a .38 caliber bullet in his fingers, and the friend watched him for a minute, then asked, "Did your father have a pistol?" Jay said yes, it was a .38. The friend asked him, "Do you have it?" Jay shook his head. "No," he said, "all I have is this bullet." Had Jenkins' pistol been tied to the missing bag of ice so that it would float until someone either retrieved it or until the ice melted and it sank? That would not be too different from the hypothetical gun tied to a balloon mentioned by Jenkins years earlier. Fortunately for Jenkins' sense of theater, this is one mystery about his death that will remain to taunt biographers, historians, and detectives. I imagine that in John's final moments, he stepped into the river until the water was over his waist, shivering until he found his footing. He stood with the gun pressed to the back of his head and looked across the river toward his ancestral home in Central Texas. Alice Roosevelt Longworth said about her father, Theodore's need for attention that he always wanted to be the corpse at every funeral. This time, Jenkins got his wish. The gun's muzzle flashed, his arms splayed, and Johnny's life ended with a headline-worthy splash. Thank you very much.
Michael, Ed Fraughton here. That was a great story.
Thank you, Ed.
I got to know Jay Evans Haley pretty well, and his son, Jay Evans Jr. I don't know if you ever met them, but what a character he was. The book, the Good Night book, Jay Evans came to see me because he said, "I want to commission you to do a project for me." And if you remember the story of Old Maud, the cow that had 27 calves by actual count. So he commissioned me to do this project. I did a small model for it, and the son ended up giving it to another person to execute the monument, but it was for the Haley Museum. He was also interested in politics. He wanted to meet J. Bracken Lee, so I got the two of them together, and we had some great times while he was here. But one of the stories he told, he said J. Bracken Lee, when he resisted paying his taxes when he was governor, went to Texas and gave a political speech, and they charged, I don't know, $5 or a few dollars to get in, and Jay Evans said, "I'd never paid real money to hear a politician speak, but I had to hear J. Bracken Lee." So it was kind of fun to get the two of them together and have some experiences together. And aside from that, I wanted to ask you if you're connected in any way to Don Vinson in California, who is the kind of the expert advisor on the trial of what's his name, the O.J. Simpson trial. Are you connected with him at all? Or do you know
No,
better?
I'm not. But the Vinson name is a very common name in the South and not in the North. So my
Ah.
people all came from the South. And in fact, one of my third great grandfather was a Texas Ranger.
Yeah. I think Don Vinson is from San Francisco.
Okay,
So
great.
thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you. And I've seen that sculpture at the Haley Museum.
The one that I didn't do, I did the small model.
Oh.
Somebody basically copied my model to do the piece. But did you ever get to know the Haleys, J.
No,
Evans, Senior and Junior?
I only ever heard
Interesting
the
characters.
Yeah, I only ever heard the
Yeah.
legends and the stories.
Well, he was a character.
He was.
Yeah.
Michael, talk a little bit to us, and thank you for the presentation, about the type of research you did in putting together that story.
Well, it was tough because several people wanted to do this book about Jenkins, and each one approached the widow, and she refused to work with each one of them. And consistently, I know 3 people that have published books, they have agents, they have biographers, and in each case, she turned them down. But after I learned that his papers had been donated, people told me, well, don't bother to do the book, they said. The papers have been purged and you won't find anything in the papers. But as it happens, I found among the 25,000 sheets of paper that I read, 4 very significant ones. And, you know, I belong to a small organization of biographers, of whom Robert Caro, the biographer of LBJ, is one. And I've met him a couple of times at cocktail parties, which, you know, for a nerd book fan like me is a wonderful thing. And Bob Caro said, the most important thing to learn in research is to turn and read every page. And so if you've got the diligence to go through and turn and read every page, you can piece together the story even when they don't want the story told.
And where is Johnny's papers?
They're at SMU in Dallas. So that was the most heartbreaking thing for me that wasn't in the talk. You know, I started in on the papers and I spent 3 or 4 weeks in my first pass going through them, 8 hours a day at the archives. I was there at the opening, and when they rang the bell to say that everybody had to leave the reading room, that was when I went home. And after 4 days, I was starting to wonder if I would find anything. And on the 5th day, I found a letter that confirmed that Johnny had been stealing Texas letters and documents from the state archives while he was working as an intern and an undergraduate student there in the early 1960s and late 1950s. The state archives in Texas is still missing over 50 letters from Sam Houston and 30 letters from Stephen F. Austin that were all stolen at this time by Jenkins. I didn't even talk about his document thefts in the thing. There's just so much to his life.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed that. You know, I loved your books, actually, Eberstadt and this. And 2 things. I wonder if you might want to draw any parallels with Jenkins and Mark Hoffman, and maybe give us a hint of what book you might be working on next.
Well, thanks for that lead in, Kurt. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's interesting because they were both forgers. You know, among the 2 types of collectors that I've dealt with, the 2 that are most passionate about collecting their history are probably Mormons, for one. And I've had some experience with that. I advised the LDS Church Historical Department. I worked as a consultant with them on the acquisition of a large private collection of Mormon documents, and Texans. And I used to joke with my spouse, I got kind of lucky because I can deal in both areas. You know, Texans and Mormons are both passionate about their history. But that passion for history also means that conniving, unscrupulous people can take advantage of that. Hoffman did that by uncovering these things that were larger than life and bigger than life. Jenkins didn't have to create new Texas history. He either stole it from the archives, or in fact, he forged the Texas Declaration of Independence. If you could find a Texas Declaration of Independence today, a printed one, you know, I could get you $1 million for it very fast. It's that valuable and that desirable. And up until the time Johnny started dealing in these things, he had found there were 5 known ones, period. And then over the course of the next 15 years, Johnny sells 12 of them himself. And in each case, there was no publicity, and he would tell each collector to be sure not to tell anybody, because that worked to his advantage. It would be very suspicious if, you know, a collector said, well, I finally bought the great, you know, Black Tulip of Texas history. And the other collector said, well, I have one too. I bought it 2 years ago. And so in that way, they have very similar paths. That passion for history, which I admire and I deeply respect, but for unscrupulous people, it's something that's very easy for them to take advantage of. In Texas Monthly Magazine, I think in the June-July issue that just came out, you may or may not know that Phil Collins, the pop singer, collects history of the Alamo. And in fact, one of my collectors once asked me to fly down to Texas because Phil Collins wanted to see his collection. And he didn't feel comfortable showing the collection to Phil Collins, but he knew that I knew the collection better than he did. And so I ended up spending 45 minutes or an hour showing Phil Collins different high spots of Texas history. And I would show him, you know, something relating to the Alamo, and he would say, oh, Michael, well, I actually have the bullet that killed Davy Crockett at the Alamo. And I remember looking at him and thinking, you know, you might have a bullet that was found by the Alamo. Whether or not who it killed might be another story entirely. And we went on like that. And one of the things I actually showed him was something that I had handled, and that was Santa Anna's own handwritten account of the taking of the Alamo and of the Mexican War afterwards, signed by Santa Anna. And when I showed him that, Phil Collins couldn't say anything. He just stared at it. And I could tell, I could see the little wheels. I don't play poker, but I do read collectors. And I could see the little wheels turning in his collector's mind, wondering how much money he could offer to buy that off of the collector. But you know, being with celebrities is always fun. And Phil Collins, he had 2 handlers that were with him the whole time that I was with him. They were going to have a reception for him that night. And as they leaned over and they whispered something to him later on. And apparently a couple of stalkers, they had just found out, Phil Collins stalkers who were breaking into the, you know, had somehow gotten admittance to the reception. And Phil Collins leaned over to me and said, Michael, I'll have the worst fans in the world. It was like, okay, whatever your problems are, Phil, that's fine. I'm actually very interested in the Mark Hoffman story. And I love the job that Tyler Measom did, fantastic Murder Among the Mormons, Netflix. It was great to see it, you know, being brought to the screen, and the years of work that he put into that. You can only admire that. I have I have dealt with a couple of things. I actually ended up selling a Hoffman forgery, unfortunately, at one point. And when I offered to return it to, you know, take it back from the buyer and refund their money, the buyer actually didn't want to do that. And so they still have it. But the morning that the first bombs went off, I was actually in a graduate history class at BYU, and I was taking a class with Dean Jesse. And lovable Dean, you know, that loved history, I was taking the class I was called as editing historical documents. And Dean Jesse, of course, was the man that authenticated most of Hoffman's forgeries. He was taken in just like everybody else was. And when the news came of the first bombing, I was with him. And I didn't hear news about the bombing. Somebody came into the seminar room, they whispered in Dean's ear, and his face just went white. And I remember watching that. And then the second bombing of Kathy Sheets, when the news came out of that, I was in the Knight Magnum building at BYU at the time, and we were mingling in the hallway with other history students and a few professors. The Institute of Church History was just down the hall. And I remember Ron Walker came out of the Institute of Church History, stood in the hall, and his commanding baritone voice told all of us, Mark Hoffman did this. And I remember thinking at the time, This is the very first morning, the day before Hoffman blows himself up, when nobody was thinking, or not many were thinking of Hoffman. But I remember thinking, if you guys thought that Hoffman is such a weasel, why were you authenticating his documents? So my connection to the story has always been peripheral, but I've always been interested. This last summer, I went in and reread Hoffman's confessions. And based on my experience in the rare book business, 35 years, this is all I've ever done my whole life. I've flagged a number of things that don't make sense, that if I had been there, I could have grilled Hoffman. Things that just didn't add up that he told them, but they didn't know because they didn't have the experience in the rare book trade that Kurt, you or I have, for example. And so based on that, I'm really seriously considering coming up to work on an article. I don't think it would be a book, but perhaps an article on the remainder of the Hoffman story. And I've recently gotten my FOIA access to the Hoffman investigative files at the Salt Lake County Attorney's Office. So I'm looking forward to going through those boxes of papers, and very excited about that.
We look forward to it.
We had Throckmorton here at our Westerners. He spoke one time, and he helped uncover all of this as well. And a very detective-like person. I guess he is a detective, and looked into it, saw that it was evident that his handwriting had been dried on a clothesline, and you could see the loops in the ink as it dripped below. And so he was able to discover that it was a forgery. But I was curious, do you know, do you work with Brent Ashworth at all?
Oh yeah, Brent's a great fellow. I know Brent very well.
He's quite the rare.
I have, he's got great stories, and he has an immense amount of passion for history and historical documents, which is a wonderful thing.
If I might interject once again, Mark spoke at the Utah Westerners, and it was an amazing thing. What a great salesman he was. But at the end of the thing, somebody asked me what I thought, and I said, well, something's wrong with this story. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, the oath of the free man has been missing for how many years, and he found 2 of them? Everybody's been looking for it. But I wondered if you know Ken Rendell, who is the expert witness in the trial against...
I do know Ken Rendell, and Ken Rendell bought the Oath of the Freeman last week for $52,000.
Is that who bought it?
Donating it to the Groyer Club, the book collecting club in New York City.
The real one, or Mark Hoffman's?
Well, the real Hoffman one, apparently. This is the one that Justin Schiller sold at Heritage Auctions last week. And the bidding started at $10,000, and he bought it for $52,500.
A genuine Mark Hoffman forgery.
Genuine Mark Hoffman. So see, Kurt, you've been undervaluing your wares once again.
Yes.
Other questions? No?
I may have a copy of his book for sale on Jenkins.
Do you, Kurt? How would
Show
somebody
show
do
it
that?
up.
Okay.
Kurt, hold it up.
Thank you, Kurt.
Kurt, how would they do that to get that from you?
Oh, it's payable in Kirtland banknotes at face value.
Okay, we got a couple of those.
No, we
From
just
Mark
have
Hoffman.
just call or come in. But don't forget, and I don't even know if I have the other one, but his book on Eberstadt is fascinating too, especially if you love old books and the trade. It's another good book. Mike is a very engaging writer, and I don't just say that because I'm a bookseller. I've really enjoyed his books.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I appreciate that.
I as well.
And it's gotten, to my surprise, the book was covered by the Wall Street Journal, Got a great review in the Wall Street Journal and also in the Washington Post, which surprised the hell out of me because usually a small book from a university press very rarely makes it to those national newspapers, as you know.
True. Way to go.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. This is wonderful. This has been very fun. Let's give him a thanks for agreeing to speak. Call Benchmark Books if you want a copy of the book. There should be a run on them, Kurt. A couple things. So next month we're having our annual film screening. When we stream them, we have copyright issues, and so we have to get old movies or ones that have kind of slipped into the public domain. Jim Dark, who's a member of Utah Westerners, of course, has helped us with that. This year's movie is called Ramona. It's a 1928 film starring Dolores Del Rio. It's a silent movie, but it's one of the first movies that had a music score, a soundtrack. So you don't hear the people talking, but the music was included as a soundtrack. This was a movie that was lost shortly after it was first screened and didn't show up until somebody found a copy or somebody brought a copy to the 2010 Czech, as in the Czech Republic Film Festival, and subsequently another copy was found in a Russian festival. So bizarre thing. The movie was filmed almost entirely in Zions National Park. It's a fun story it's based on a 19th century novel, which has been made into movie at least 4 or 5 times. Another version is in 1936. Jim will provide expert introduction and then commentary afterwards. We'll figure out a way to make it available to everybody on Zoom or some other way where we can all watch it together. And hopefully this will be the last time we have to try to do it this way. Mark your calendars for July 20th and be sure to join us. Watch the newsletter to see whether we'll try to just have one more Zoom presentation in August, or whether we try to figure out some way to do that live, at least for those of us who can attend live in the Alta Club. Is there anything else we need to talk about that anyone wants to raise? Thank you very much. Thanks, Mike. It's great to see you. And this is just a fascinating, fun it's just so Texas. I mean, it's just so start to finish. This is just a Texas story that could only happen there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great honor. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Okay.
So Ken, thanks to our two new members. We are delighted to have you aboard.
We are.
And look forward to having time to visit in person.
And
thank you, Michael.
Walter Jones has a bunch of new membership badges to hand out because we've got lots of new members and none of them have gotten handed out because we haven't met in person. That'll be just a joyous day when we can all get together physically again. And talk to you next month. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you for all your help put this together.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.